we're here for our inaugural medical English podcast. We'll go with medical English.
Yeah.
Now I've got to look up the etymology of inaugural, so thanks for that.
Yeah.
More homework.
Inauguration,
Yeah.
all those terms.
Yeah.
We should start the podcast with like a random word that we use like that.
Yeah.
I
We
listened to a
should.
few other podcasts that they like, when it was episode number 1, they gave like all these things that had to do with the number 1, like number 7, like meanings, 7 days in a week, they'd
Right.
start with stuff like that. And we're all about meanings and background. So
Yeah.
this, again, medical terminology, medical English podcast. Justin Burr, joining you here. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Health Sciences at Weber State. My background is athletic training and physical therapy, moved into academics. Madison, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Maddison Johnston. I am the newest faculty member of the Health Sciences Department here. And
I don't think that's true.
That is, I guess that's not true as of about a week ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And
maybe.
also making me sad because I'm the oldest faculty member.
Yes, so I guess I'm the second newest faculty member within
Better.
the last couple weeks here. My background is in nursing. I have my master's in nursing education, working on my doctorate degree right now, but background specifically in women's health.
My name is Jim Hutchins, and I've been in the Health Sciences Department at Weber State University for 20 years now, as I was saying, and my training is as a PhD neuroscientist, and so I started out in the research lab and then took a brief stint in administration, and now I'm a faculty member and have been for a long time.
Do we point out that Jim was like the faculty member when we were students here?
Yes, that's one of the awesome things actually about working at Weber State. And now, Justin, you've just had your first experience with this, is having our students come back and be colleagues later on. And so, that's the coolest thing ever. So now you're old enough
I am old
that you've had a student come back and our newest hire.
Yes,
as
our actual
faculty-
newest.
newest
Yeah.
hire is a former student of Justin's, protege, and that also is something that we want our students to know is, and I tell students all the time, is that everyone in this field got to where they're going by having a mentor. And so that means that everyone that you interact with, all of your faculty, have what I call a mentor hook. That somewhere on there you can hook onto their mentor and say, I want you to be my mentor, either explicitly or implicitly, and they'll do it. It's something that students should know, because I think they get intimidated by us and they think that we're like somehow separate or like some sort of priesthood or something, and we're not. We're just regular people who got to where we got by having someone take an interest in us and say, hey, here's what I have, here's a faculty position that I have, and here's how I got here, and here's a path that you can take to get to where I am.
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. So, and we're always recruiting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a great idea. So, we're introducing the medical terminology course here in Unit 1 of the class, and it's really almost really an introduction to the introduction, right?
Yeah.
This is an introductory unit, kind of explaining how we approach medical terminology, medical English, and how that all comes together. So I think that's the first lead in, just like how do we approach the course or the terms, Madison?
Yeah. Well, I always make a joke with students that by the time they get done with our medical English course, as well as some of our other courses, that they can testify that they truly about halfway speak Greek and Latin. Because of all of, just the roots of our words and where they come from and their origins and all of that. And so I always try and introduce it, telling students you need to have some grace with yourself, because more than anything, this is a language class. And so you need to approach it that way, right? You're learning a new language, even though it's English, it's medical English. And so I always approach it as a brand new language. But I'm also a really, really big fan of stupid stories and different memorization tricks and tips, and for better or for worse, that's how I was taught, was through mnemonics and anecdotes and all of that. And so that's also how I teach as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that language thing, because it's like learning another language, but it's like 8 languages.
Yeah.
Like all mixed together with no rules.
Right.
That's
Let's
kind
just
of
make
sometimes
it
how
the worst thing in the world. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Which is what English is so not just medical English, but American English is just a mixture of whatever we decided to pull in. So there's a little bit of French, a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Latin, all kinds of things that show up on a regular basis.
Kind of interesting as we kind of go through those. Jim, how did you approach medical terminology?
Well, I have a really unique history. I went to college thinking that I was going to be a journalism major, and did take a journalism major for a few months. But after my first journalism class, I decided I didn't want to do that. And so I had 9 different majors when I was in college.
Wow.
And declared. And that was when you had to go to the dean's office and
Right.
fill out a piece of paper because there were no computers then. So
Does that count grad school?
No,
Okay.
that's 9 undergraduate
Okay.
majors, and that was in 2 years span.
Wow.
Because then I had to settle on something which turned out to be molecular, cellular, and developmental biology was my final major, and that was what I graduated in. But at that point, I had no elective credits left, and so I took nothing but MCDB classes. That's what we called it, was MCD biology or MCDB. Took nothing but MCDB classes for 2 years, which was a real slog. That was difficult. But I had all my generals done. And among other things, I was an English major, first creative writing and then English literature and literary analysis. And it's really interesting to me how much of learning medical English is learning the origins of words and the analysis of words. As Maddison was saying, you can't easily learn medical English or any language by just memorizing something.
Yeah.
And if you take any language class in our world languages department, for example, you take a language class and you're going to be surprised maybe that so much of the class is about the culture of that country that the language comes from, because language and culture are inextricably tied. And I think as we take this journey and we look at medical English, we're going to see that the culture of medicine is as important. In fact, my colleague Marie Cotter, who taught me how to teach medical terminology, spent all of her time in medical terminology, HTHS 1101 for us, all of her time talking about the culture of medicine and almost no time talking about how to learn words, because students were expected to learn those on their own. And so I would say let's embrace that. Let's run to that, not run away from it, and embrace the culture of medicine and learning about the culture of medicine as we learn about the words of medicine. And so you just kind of amplifying on your point, that's part of this is not just talking about the words, because that's boring, frankly, and dull as dishwater, but talking about where the words exist as part of a culture. Things like orchid or testes.
Yeah. Yep.
Right, where they come from. Yeah, because I think that leads into a little bit of how we were talking about earlier, how I look at things a little bit too, where a lot of times when they discover these terms, the words are coming from available words in their culture and their language already, right? They're seeing something, like this is the first time they've ever cut an animal open and they're seeing something or something for the first time and they're saying, that looks like this. We talked about pyramids in the neuro podcast the other week, Jim, and I always think of that too when that they used what was available to them to describe the things that they were seeing, and sometimes you have to take it in that lens of like, well, why are they calling it that? And that's just the words they had available. Like they didn't make up new ones, at least a lot of the time. So I think that's why the phrase, you said like the language is like learning Greek. When people say like it's all Greek to me, sometimes, right? Because it's like this, I'm not understanding it. It's all.
Yeah. I always make the joke. I can tell when I'm lecturing and my students are not understanding what I'm saying. And I always say, you're looking at me like I'm speaking Latin, right? Which then I always follow it up with, if you had taken our medical English course, you'd probably understand what I was saying. But yeah, I agree.
Always fits in there. So, right, big fat Greek wedding scene is what I go on there. He's driving all the kids to school, which is probably embarrassing for, I don't know how many teenage kids yet. Right, I can imagine when my daughter is a teenager 13, and I'm 14, driving to school and I'm embarrassing her by, talking about medical English probably and how that's cool. As we're going to her class next week in 3rd grade to talk about the body. So things like that. But he's trying to tell them that every word out there, because they're Greek and very proud of it. And how every word has a Greek origin. Everything comes from the Greeks. It's kind of his thing. And so he talks about like arachnophobia and saying like, that's a pretty easy one, right? That means fear of spiders. And he's like, there you go. And so they give him a word like kimono. And they're like, where does that come from? And he goes through this like layering of like, it comes from this word, which came from that word, which comes from this word, which means robe. therefore, what do you wear in the winter when it's cold, right? He says, a robe.
Yep.
Anyways, and
Yep.
sometimes I take that approach of saying, like,
Yeah.
sometimes it's not like a direct meaning. It's like
Yeah.
you kind of have to take like this
Kind of a
process
journey.
of like, well, they're trying to describe this
Yes.
in words that
Yes.
were available.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
Well, there was no market for the movie called My Big Fat Proto-Indo-European wedding, right?
Doesn't roll off the tongue quite.
No. But every once in a while in the medical English book, I would discover words as I was working on it that came from the Proto-Indo-European roots. It's amazing sometimes to come across Lithuanian words in medical English, right? Because there's, if you go into the etymology, everything comes from, at least Western languages all come from one language that started in South Asia and spread out from there to Iran and Persian, Farsi. Comes from that same tradition, and then of course that spread from spoken language into written language. In Mesopotamia, which I'll refrain from singing about, but in Sumerians, which developed in Mesopotamia, who developed the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, who developed the first written language, mostly for administrative purposes, right? You find out that the first written language was bills, the king collecting taxes. Okay, right. That was what we invented writing for, and so then it spread out from there. And so all languages that come from west of the Himalayas have the same basic origin, and it's just fascinating to see that. And then even some languages that worldwide, for example, why do we call our mother mama is because that's one of the first words that babies say without even meaning to. And they learn to use language to get milk. Yeah. And so that's where mammary comes from, if we want to take that into medical English, okay? Mama is from mama, which means just I want to eat. Yeah. But that's the best that a baby can do early in their life is to say ma, ma. Yeah. And so ma in all languages all across the world means mother, because that typically is the first sound. Phoneme is the fancy word for that babies make.
Yeah. Yep.
Interesting. So here in Unit 1, right, we kind of go through, and it's really, like we said, it's introduction. So we're talking about the starting points are word building. We got to take these words that have these meanings, and then we have to combine them in some way to be able to express, I guess, what those meanings are, the thing we want to describe. Yep. So word building, I think, is the basis of the course and really why it was built the way it is. Jim was the architect, which probably has some nice. Now every word I say, I'm worried that Jim's got like, hey, look up the background of architect and archaeology and all that, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm the old one. I'm the architect.
The architect of that. Yes. But what was kind of the architecture of the course based on word building?
So again, we took students who had graduated from our program and were in the nursing program and had them go through the textbook that we were using at the time, plus our 1110 textbook, plus our 1111 textbook, so our anatomy and physiology textbooks, and take anything that looked like a medical word and enter it in a spreadsheet. And if they could break it down, which many times they couldn't, then they went ahead and broke it down. But if they couldn't, then I broke it down. Yeah. And so I had these columns in the spreadsheet that I jokingly called, for example, pre-root and root, which is the middle root, and then post-root, okay? And I was just kind of fooling around, but then I got to liking those so much that, as you can see, those appear in the textbook, right? When you take a medical English textbook, when you take a medical terminology textbook, every single one of them says that a medical word is made up of a prefix, root, and a suffix. Right. They say that categorically. It's just not true. Yeah. It's only a plurality, but a minority of the medical English words that follow that pattern. And so many times you have two prefixes and a root and a couple of suffixes, or just a prefix and a suffix in a couple of cases. You don't even have a root.
Right.
That happens all the time in medical English. And so I decided, why do we lie to the students and tell them to expect and set their brains on expecting prefix, root, suffix, when that almost never happens,
right.
or it doesn't happen that way a majority of the time. So let's break this down. And then what I did with that spreadsheet, which had over 3,000 words in it, was to sort the columns using my Excel foo. Then I sorted the columns and just pulled out like the 25 most common roots. And those are the 25 most common roots that you see. And it was a surprise. It wasn't what I would have expected, because some things that were really common, like thyroid, which you're going to talk about later, I didn't expect to be on the top 25 list, and yet there they were. And so we took the 25 most common words, and I said to myself, how many medical English words can I build from these 25 roots? And let me take a minimum number of prefixes and a minimum number of suffixes and see how many words I could build. And the number is something like 347, somewhere around 350. And I don't know about you guys, and I want to kick it back to you, but when you go into the classroom and you tell them either explicitly or implicitly, in the next 2 weeks, we're going to learn 350 medical English words, their eyes get dark and sad. They look at me like I've gone mad, and there is no way you can teach me these things, and this is crazy, and what have I gotten myself into? And this is the worst class I've ever taken. And I don't deliberately want to do that, but it's kind of interesting to see the difference between that and after they take our first unit quiz. And they really have mastered 347 medical English words in a way we're going to talk about in this podcast. And it's a beautiful thing to see the empowerment that they feel and how they really know that they can do it. Yeah. All they have to do is just apply the time. We'll talk about some of that later. But if you put the time in, then this will work for you, because you already have inside of you. It's, to speak of Greek, as the origin of the word, education comes from educt, which means E is out of, and duct is a drawing, like a ventilation duct in a building. And so the Greeks believed something that's not exactly true, which is that all that knowledge is inside you, and all the teacher has to do is to educate you, is to bring out that knowledge that you have in you already. Yeah. But in this case, it happens to be true, is that my students come into the classroom already knowing medical English. Yeah. It's just they don't have it organized. They don't have it put together. Yep. And we just educt them. We just educate them in medical English.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jim brought up, the main parts of the words, right? We talked about root words, prefixes, suffixes. We haven't defined them yet, though. Yeah. So I don't know if, Maddison, you want to take on a root. Let's do root, because that's kind of gives us our main meaning, right?
Yeah. So roots, I like to think about roots as like the main portion of the word. It's what we're trying to indicate. Usually it's some kind of an organ or a process or something like that. Does anybody want to add on a definition before I jump into it?
Well, I think of it like the root of a plant, right? The plant doesn't exist without its root, and so the root is what anchors the plant in the ground, and the root of a word is what anchors that word into medical English.
Yeah, it really kind of gives it the majority of the meaning, right?
Like it's what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the roots that I find fascinating is lith or litho. And so it's a Latin root, and it means lithus, or lithus means stone or rock. And so we talk about kidney stones or gallstones, but the proper, medical English or medical terminology root for that is lith. And so a nephrolith is a kidney stone or a kidney rock. And I think especially this really hits home for students when you're lecturing. If you ask who has had a kidney stone,
that's a memory.
Yeah, that's a memorable experience for many that have had that, right? And so when you say it means a rock, and so when you ask students how they have felt when they've had maybe a kidney stone, does it feel like there's a rock rocking back and forth in your kidney? Yeah, it does, because that's what it means, right? And so I think that's really fascinating.
And that's a pretty good example if one's going to define root, right? Because that's a root.
Yeah, exactly.
You just did a root.
Yep,
yeah, so it's
root.
not a prefix, root, suffix, but it's just two roots put together. Yep. Nephro, which is kidney, and lith, which is stone.
Yep.
I was going with Frankenstein because Jim said it earlier, and I looked it up, and Stein means stone.
Yeah.
Which I didn't know
I
in
didn't
German.
either. Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
Another stone.
Another stone.
That we were.
Of Frankenstein.
Exactly. I don't, I'm
Okay,
not.
that's another movie that
Yes.
we can.
Yes.
Yeah, it was.
good show.
That was actually my first date was to Young Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love it.
that's how old I am.
Did you give each other flowers?
We did not.
Okay.
No,
No orchids
no.
on those.
No, that was
Good. So we got a root.
Yeah.
The thing we're talking about, Jim, prefixes. What's a prefix?
prefixes. So prefixes, fix is to stick on something, right? And so prefixes are stuck on to the front of a word, prefix. We already know what prefix, and pre is a prefix, so it's almost self-referential, right? It's a circular kind of thing. So pre means in front of, and fix means to stick to. So it's what's stuck in front of the word is the prefix.
Right. Prefix has a prefix.
Yeah.
Prefix is a prefix.
Yeah.
It has a prefix and a root.
In the words.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's good.
There you go.
So we had those two, right? Prefix, root, and then sometimes a suffix, right, which usually comes at the end of the word.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, that's been the historical teaching avenue of saying there's a prefix, a suffix, and a root, or something like that along those lines. Like you say, not every word is that way, so we want to practice building them. On that note, I'm going to make a little plug for saying them also.
Yes.
I think we haven't said that, but especially in like an online class setting. I know on the campus classes, they probably don't love it that I make them say the words out loud, but I always joke that I can always tell when like I talk to a student who has taken the course online because
pronunciation's off.
right, a lot of times especially before these podcasts, right, if they were online, like you just read them in the book and you never heard anyone say them and you never said them yourself, and
And it's important, and Maddison can speak to this more than I can because it's been a while since I've been in a clinical setting myself, but I would say that almost always when you hear the word used or when you're using medical English in a real clinical setting, you're using it orally. That you're taking report from another staff member, or you're discussing a patient's condition, and those are all oral settings.
Yeah.
Yes, you can see them sometimes inside the patient's chart,
Right.
but that's less usual. And if you think about the number of times during the day that you hear a medical English word when you're in a clinical setting, you're going to hear it orally almost always.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and to Justin's point about how important it is to say these words, there's nothing more, I don't want to say embarrassing, but it can be.
Yeah, annoying, and also it produces inaccuracies because if you don't understand what your coworker is saying, then you don't understand what is going on with the patient.
Right, and I think, just from my background, I spent a lot of time on the phone with doctors. That's just the life of a nurse, and so you always want to have your ducks in a row before you call the physician. And maybe you have all your ducks in a row, but you pronounce something a little bit off. They will not let you live that one down. And so that's always something I like to bring it back around to my students too, is it's not just important that you know what these words mean, but it's really important clinically for you to be able to pronounce these so that you come across as a competent healthcare worker. For our patients. And
speaking of pronunciation, Justin, you've been in New York. I spent 16 years in the Deep South in Mississippi, and I found that the pronunciation of these words can often be regional in a surprising kind of way. So in the South, because of the influence of Cajun culture in Jackson, Mississippi, Cajun culture is just south of there, and in Acadia in Louisiana, where the name comes from, that they use the word sonometer. So in your OBGYN clinic, Maddison, a doctor would say, this patient is dilated to 8 sonometers. And the first time I heard it, it really brought me up short because I learned centimeters, and I believe that's still how we pronounce it here in Utah is centimeters, right? But in the South, you just have to get used to tuning your brain to sonometer, which is a French-oid, speaking of oid, is a French-oid kind of pronunciation.
Which is funny because you initially said sonometer, and just because of my OB background, I immediately went to sonogram. Right.
Yes.
And so that's where, you can get into some sticky situations a little bit too. Yeah.
We're saying that. And so we're getting to this etymology of a word. And I think as we kind of build the words and we say they're regions, but maybe we define that word, etymology.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right? Because that's really the origin of the words. So we got the beginning of that, right, means like the origin. It actually means what's true in Greek.
Yes.
So that's interesting. And then ology, which I think is everyone's favorite.
Yeah.
In med-term.
Yeah.
Because they love the questions that have ology at the end because it's the study of the thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
But basically, it's kind of like the study of what's true, like the study of the origin of these words, like where do they come from?
Yeah.
Which is kind of an interesting thing. So since you set it off with oid, right? Like I think you said Frenchoid, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, I
kind of
did.
come from there and from that language. I had kind of picked thyroid as my word or
Yeah.
example from the word list in here in this unit that I thought was kind of fun and had a nice
Yep.
background because really long time back, early days, right before they even said what like the thyroid gland even was,
Yeah.
they were kind of basing the word off of the cartilage, like our Adam's apple, like the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple, and the original word meaning for that was like it was like a shield,
Right.
right? So the thyroid part in that is shield, and then the oid, as Jim had referenced earlier, was something resembling
Right.
something. So it was a shield-like looking structure. Again, kind of just based on what the appearance is. They
Yeah.
said, hey, that kind of looks like a shield. It resembles a shield, kind of right here in your neck, throat area. And there we go, right? That's our word. I always say that when it's,
Yeah.
again, back to my big fat Greek quitting. Is,
Right.
there you go,
There
right?
you
Because
go.
that's what he always says is like, that's where the words come from.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we did a brief introduction, prefixes, root suffixes, a few examples, right? You'll go through the text and there'll be lots of examples in there. The other piece of this first unit here in the course to introduce is when singular words and plural words and how we go about saying when things are multiples or single. So, and I know this is always kind of a, I actually think it's kind of fun this way when we say there's no rules because I like to have no rules and it's
Right.
all just fair game. But the students don't love when there's
Right.
no rules.
We want a hard and fast rule.
Right, they want to learn this is why and that's what it is. Because I think sometimes in language, that's probably why learning English is hard too. When
Yeah.
they're like, wait a minute,
Right. That's
I before E, except after C, and
Right,
all
and
that
18
stuff,
other
right? Like
choices.
have it. You know, we always make rules to break them. I feel like
Yep.
so.
Yep.
Singular and plurals get a little bit tough in this case. Jim, I think you had kind of some background on singular and plurals you wanted to share.
Yeah, it's actually a rant, which I have to modify because one of the things we were talking about how we teach the course, and I fought a losing war, a losing battle against flashcards for a long, long time. Flashcards, as a neuroscientist, I recognize the value of flashcards as memorization tools, but there are very few times in your college courses that you just need to memorize things. It's much better to move up what's called Bloom's taxonomy, which is our term of art that we use for the way in which people learn from a very basic level, and it's always represented as a pyramid. So the very basic level, which is memorization, which is just figuring things out and memorizing what they mean. But then in your college career, you're going to have to move up Bloom's taxonomy into a true understanding. And it's actually what you're talking about in dog training, which is my other life. We use the same term we use in world languages, which is fluency. And so fluency is being able to recognize things in all different kinds of contexts. So the problem with memorization is context specific in terms of learning theory. And so I can memorize something as long as someone is holding on to that flashcard that I've made and I can see them sitting in front of me with that flashcard. But then generalizing that knowledge to them not sitting in front of me because I'm now at the testing center and I don't have my flashcards anymore because I had to leave them in the cubby on my way into the testing center. That doesn't work anymore. And we're surprised how context specific our memorization is. So in general, I don't advise students to memorize. We talked about some of the methods we use, like we didn't talk about this, but thinking of a word that resembles that, that you know, like testify, testicle, and even if they don't share a common etymology, just having a word picture in your head is really helpful. Listening to things like this, and I call it building more routes into the city. And so if you have just one route into the city, which is your flashcards, and then the road gets a big pothole in it, then you're stuck and you can't get anything into or out of that city, that circuitry in the brain that you're trying to access, right? So what the city is in this analogy or this metaphor. But in this case, coming back around to plurals, I'm sorry, but unless we want to learn Greek, which I don't think we do, unless you want to learn Greek, the way in which plurals are made in Greek and in Latin, but especially in Greek, is just weird.
Yeah.
And the way that the words fit together is weird. The way that you use a word as an adjective instead of a noun. So, for example, and this is getting away from plurals, but just to show you how complicated this can get, in anatomy, we teach about a bone in the neck that's called the atlas. And it's a wonderful joke because the atlas is what holds your world up. Your world is your head, and it holds your head up. Okay, and so you imagine Atlas in Greek mythology holding up the world. But it turns out that when you dislocate the occipital bone of the skull, which is what articulates with, which makes a joint with the atlas, we call that an atlanto-occipital dislocation, because now we're using atlas not as a noun but as an adjective.
Right.
Okay, and Atlanto is the same as Atlantic. And you realize that's because that's where Atlas was. And the Greeks would not sail. They were wonderful sailors, and they sailed in battle. And you know, the whole, Iliad and the Odyssey is about the Greeks being great sailors, right? And so they were wonderful sailors, but they would not sail past the Mediterranean Ocean, which, by the way, means Middle Earth, okay? They wouldn't sail past the Mediterranean Sea because that's where Atlas was.
Right.
And you just didn't know what was going to happen there if you got, But Atlantis was there, okay, to take another, okay?
Yeah.
And so this is what happens in Greek origin words, is that they change their shape. To me, that's what I'm calling it. That's the metaphor that I'm using. They change their shape in ways that just make my English-speaking brain hurt. And so really all we can do is just learn the plurals. For example, a carcinoma. Oma is tumor. Carcin means crab in Greek, and that's where we get the astrological sign Cancer from the something that looked like a crab. But it was their mnemonics, right? It was their way that they could remember the stars by making up stuff about what the shape of the stars was. Nobody sees those shapes, but that was their way of learning. They memorized. They would have troops that, or a single person sometimes, that went from town to town because there was no other entertainment, and they memorized the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those were oral stories before they were written down, before there was written language. And so they just went from town to town telling these stories. And for a long time, neuroscientists didn't believe that one person could memorize the entire Iliad, and yet one person can. And we'll talk later on about like memorization strategies. It uses the method of loci, the method of places. We were talking about cancer, the crab, carcinoma, which is a crab-like tumor that sends out tendrils and grows into your body. The plural of that is just completely unexpected. It's carcinomata.
Mata.
Mata, which is just a strange thing to do. Or in one of the videos that we used to use in the course, and I don't know how much longer it's going to be available, Corey Stamper, who was at the time an associate editor at Merriam-Webster, talks about the plural of the word octopus. And she gets into this, that we assume, based on the U.S. ending, that octopus is a Latin word. And so if it were Latin, the plural would be octopi. And a lot of people think that the plural of octopus is octopi. But it's not, for two reasons. One is that it's been incorporated into English, not medical English, but standard English. And when you adopt into standard English, you use the plural rules that are there in that language, okay, that are in language. So in English, not medical English, but in non-medical English, octopuses is the correct plural. Okay, if octopus were a medical English word, which it's not, then it would take the Greek plural, which is octopodes.
It's like hepatitis.
Hepatitis, which is
so
a word that I
hepatitis.
can't say, so thank you for that.
Hepatitis is the plural for hepatitis.
Hepatitis, exactly. Yeah. And so irides is the plural of iris. So you have beautiful irides.
such a compliment.
You do. You have, yes.
Two of them.
Two of them.
Two
I
of
have
More
a
than
whole,
one.
Yes.
I have a whole
Yes.
two.
You have two, yes. And but if we're talking about multiple ones, then it's irides, IRIDES.
Yeah.
Again, all these are strange, and there's really, I believe, nothing to be done except memorize them, because the alternative is learning all these different plural forms, and we really only have 3 or 4. I'm doing that from memory, but I think like 3 or 4 in Greek and 3 or 4 in Latin you have to learn.
Right.
And so we just have it in Unit 1. It's kind of like an add-on and it doesn't belong to anything else. But just as a point that when you come across those plurals, we don't want you to be thrown by them.
Right. Because you mentioned the ones we have like alveolus becoming alveoli.
Yep.
Yes.
Right. Ampulla becoming ampullae, bursa, bursae, those types of things.
Yeah.
Yep.
I always love your note in here too, where you'll put one in there as like the little star.
Yeah.
Right. The asterisk next to it, and at the bottom it says this doesn't follow the pattern, and I don't know why.
Yeah.
Which I always enjoy the best when I'm talking to
Yes.
students. Like I would say it's okay
Yeah.
that there's not always.
A reason.
Again, they don't love this whole gray area of
Yeah, they
medicine and life. And I think clinically, we talk
Yeah.
clinically, where like the clinic is all gray
It's
area.
all gray, yeah.
You know, students want this is the textbook, this is what this is. And then you go out in the real world and that's not the way it is. And I'd say
Patients are gray, right?
that's like the same story
Yeah.
with medical words, right? Like there's meanings and there's things, but then I think kind of making this point, like clinic speaking of it, where there'll be like, you know, our algia and dynia, speaking of
Yeah.
our suffixes, which show up a lot because
Yeah.
they're pain in
Yeah.
all these places. Those
Yeah.
both mean pain. And they go to build the word and they're like, well, why can't it be
Right.
like,
This one.
why are we saying arthralgia instead of arthrodynia? And because that's just what we do.
Yeah.
Right. Like this is
Yep.
almost the culture side that you were speaking.
Yeah.
Like it's not wrong.
Yeah.
Right. Like they both mean the same thing. They both mean joint pain, like in PT.
Right. But
But like we don't really say arthrodynia that often
No.
in PT. Like I don't
Yeah.
hear I hear arthralgia a lot.
Yeah.
But I don't. Arthrodynia is not really.
right.
It's just culturally not
Yeah.
used, even though it's not wrong.
No.
But it's not right.
Yeah.
Either.
Yes.
And the example you cite is something that I've been using all my life because I'm a neuroscientist, and so we talk about cerebral cortex. And so I've been using the plural cortices without really thinking about it. But
Yeah.
X in Latin gets replaced with CES, but you're not supposed to replace the vowel, and in cortices you do. So appendix is appendices.
Right. The I stays.
And the I stays,
Yeah,
right?
an appendix.
But in cortex, the E turns into an I, and that makes it different than any other plural that ends in X.
Thorax,
Of a singular
thoraces.
word that ends
Yeah.
in X, yeah.
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 So
And so, thorax, thoraces, okay. But here we replace the vowel, and I have no idea why. I have no idea how that started.
Yeah.
There's later on we'll probably cover this, but there's an interesting etymology for the word acne, which I think we've all experienced, right? And we've not really thought much about where acne comes from. And acne itself has a really strange etymology that we'll talk about later when we get to the dermatology unit.
yeah, on skin, that unit. So that kind of wraps up. I mean, Unit 1. That's the
Yeah.
basics of medical English, medical terminology here
Yeah.
that we're kind of going through. We're going to have prefixes that we're going to learn. We're going to have roots and suffixes. And I think to Madison's point, that's, I think my going out thing. Maybe we can all give a tip or something. And it's kind of just be patient early on. I usually say, in my experience, the class and the terms get easier as time goes because the more you see them, and you'll see them
Repetition.
recurring. By the end of the class, I say we just learn new roots because we'll have learned all the prefixes and suffixes.
Yep.
The class should kind of get easier as we
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
But to be patient, just like you would be patient with yourself learning a language early
Yeah.
on, you'd be like, well, of course I'm going to say things wrong, and I'm
Right.
going to get things wrong. Like the first time I don't speak any languages
Yeah.
other than English, but if I was like trying to learn Spanish and was
Right.
going in there, I'd be like, I'm going to say stuff wrong.
Yeah. That's just what
Right?
it is. Yep.
Yeah.
We were joking about John F. Kennedy. What did he say?
I
Called himself
have a jelly donut, but that's an urban legend. But still,
Oh.
it's an interesting story. But in terms of mistranslation, Jimmy Carter did say, "I have a lust in my heart for the Polish people." He did say, "I want to sleep carnally with the Polish people." He did say that, and that translator got fired for that one.
Right? There's this thing where, like, especially early on, we're going to make mistakes. So
Yep.
I guess that's my parting
Yeah.
kind of advice, to be
Yeah.
patient, work through the words. We'll make mistakes. We learn from them. We'll see them repetitively
Yeah.
throughout. I don't know if you had any other.
Yeah. On it, and this probably just comes from me being a nerd, but I think that enjoy it and be excited because it is really fun, and it is a really good segue into what you're going to see in your career And so that should excite you and make you feel enthusiastic about what you're going into, and hopefully it brings it all full circle for you.
Yeah, I'm going to get that too, kind of the lean in,
Yeah.
right? Like a lot of people
Yep.
are like, oh, midterm, it's boring.
Right.
I have to
Right.
memorize a whole bunch of stuff. But if you lean into it,
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully they can kind of hear it here, where like the meaning and the background of these words, if you lean into the course, you'll actually find it pretty
Fascinating.
interesting and enjoyable to learn about these things.
Yeah.
My advice comes from me being a different kind of nerd, an English nerd, and being a former English major. I would nominate 2 sentences for the greatest sentence in the English language, even though the first one was written in German and translated into English. That's in the fiction division, and it comes from a short story by Kafka called The Metamorphosis, which is its own interesting etymology we'll get to later. But in the Metamorphosis, the first sentence is, Gregor Samsa awoke from uneasy dreams to find himself transformed into a gigantic insect. And that is just a beautiful sentence right there, because it opens up the whole story, and
Yeah.
you begin to wonder, like, what's going on here, right?
Yeah.
But my advice is my nomination for the best sentence in English in the nonfiction division, which was from a book. It was the very first words in a book that my mother read in the 1950s and used to raise me and my sister. It was called Baby and Child Care by Benjamin Spock. And at the time, to put things in context like we talked about, there was a whole Victorian idea that had come and survived through the Second World War, that children were really difficult to raise, and that you needed to follow, just like you do in medical English, that you needed to follow some really long set of rules, and you had to do it this way, and you had to do it this way, and you had to do it that way, or else your child would come out warped and who knows what, right? With 3 eyes or something like that, if you raised your child wrong. And baby and child care was so amazing for people in your profession, in OBGYN, because for the first time it was like, you have the instinct as a mother to know exactly what to do. You know, if you just let your heart guide you, your heart knows how to raise a child. We've been doing this for centuries. There were no manuals in the primordial environment. We just did it.
You can do
we
this.
learned from each other. We relied on our community.
Utilize the village.
This is my advice to you, is to start over again and think about medical English this way, or any college subject really. But the very first sentence in baby and child care is, you know more than you think you do.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's what I tell my students. You know more than you think you do. If you will get your fearful brain out of the way of your learning brain, your learning brain can do some incredible things, already has, to get you to this point in life, and will continue to do incredible things for you. If you just, and this sort of the 3 different versions of the same advice, which is just relax and enjoy the trip. And it's going to be fun because you're learning things that you basically know already. We're just reorganizing them in different ways.
Yep. I agree.
Very good. So that'll wrap up Unit 1 for us. So until next time, I guess they'll keep exploring medical terms, and we'll uncover more terms next time.
Yeah.